And thank you for sticking around. Again, my name is David. I serve as president at Pacific School of Religion, and as I've already said earlier, that's Pastor Jennifer's alma mater. I've been at PSR for about 9 years. It will be 9 years in January, and it's just a really remarkable community and a great place. Oftentimes, I'll say a little bit about myself in terms of this conversation, and then share a few slides and talk through a few things. But my hope is that we can get to thoughts, questions that you have, and hopefully add to the conversation you already are having as a congregation about how to become a more welcoming space and have an influence on your community, not just the congregation, but the area around an important issue around migration. Migration and this conversation for me is very personal. I'm originally from Guatemala, so it's my own experience of migration. I like to joke that my family is connected by love and coffee. So Guatemala has some of the best coffee in the world. I would say the best, but have to keep it open. And my children are originally from Ethiopia, which is considered the origins of coffee, right, in Ethiopia. So they also are immigrant in a different way, having grown up in this country, but coming as children. And then my wife's family is Finnish. Finns drink the most coffee per capita in the world. And even though my wife, Carla, was born in the U.S., and so was her father and mother, and so was her grandmother, her father never learned English until he went to to elementary school. Carla grew up with a very clear Finnish identity, going to church in Finnish, even as a third generation growing up in northern Minnesota. So migration is both a personal reality. I think it has shaped my life, the life of my community. You'll notice my last name is Vasquez Levy, so that's a hyphenated last name. Vasquez is my dad's side of the family, so there's a particular history of migration into Guatemala on that side of the family with native communities. And the Levy is my mom's side of the family that is Jewish. And so that's another experience of migration that has shaped my family history with displacement that's been forced generations after generations. So I come to this with a personal commitment and interest, conviction that migration is one of the key experiences of human life. People move constantly and either pursuing opportunities, or we'll talk some about that, or leaving from things that have been difficult. But something happens in the sacred text where humans, when they're on the move, are open to the divine in particular ways. Most sacred stories have to do with migration. I reflected on that today on Jacob, who spent his life in exile and now is coming back. But most stories in the Bible have to do with migration. My hope in our conversation today is that we might move a little bit beyond the standard texts we use to speak about immigration. So if you've ever put together Bible and migration, what text comes to mind? What scripture? Exodus, okay. And so, Abraham, yeah. Moses, Purim, yes, Purim, which is, yeah. So Purim is the story of Esther, and again, she is displaced, has to hide her identity, pretend to be somebody else and come back. Ruth and Naomi, right? So Naomi has to migrate because of hunger, and political instability, and then ends up coming back. And gender inequality, all these things. So there's a great Bible study many Bible studies on the book of Ruth. So anyway, so I come to this both with a personal commitment, but also an understanding of it through the lens of stories and migration. And sometimes I'll be asked, why are you thinking about immigration? You're a seminary president. Go do those things and get ready, get people ready to lead worship. For me, this is one of my communities of accountability, right, on whose behalf I do my work. So my commitment is to theological education comes out of a sense that we need to understand the role of the church in the world as a community on the move, right? That we are regularly trying to do this work of thinking about our past and our future, as most immigrants do. But also, I think in most social issues we deal with, there's different ways in which we might affect change. Many of us begin with direct service, a service trip, an opportunity to help somebody in our neighborhood who needs some kind of assistance with food, with housing, with whatever it is. So that's a critically important way in which we express our faith as people called to serve, right? It's in direct service. Some of us dedicate our lives to scaled direct service. That's the next level of change, right? Not only will I do this voluntarily, but maybe I'll dedicate my life to create an organization or support an organization that's trying to provide assistance at scale, right? And that's important work as well. At some point, if you're in that work, you're a social worker or a leader of a not-for-profit, you start thinking policies are whacked. Something needs to be thought about in terms of the policies that inform this work, right? And so people might run for elected office or try to create advocacy work around policy in order to try to deal with the things that ultimately create the conditions and how we respond. All of those levels of change are critically important. Theological education for me, the work of the church, is actually the next level, which is what we need to do right now. And this is the narrative level, the frameworks level. There are certain narratives that inform our policies that then lead to the ways we are able to respond. So what are the narratives about immigration? The big picture understanding. Are we a nation of immigrants who are strengthened by the arrival of immigrants? That's one narrative. There's a different narrative. We are under threat by the displacement. We have a privilege we must protect. That's a particular narrative, right? So right now, I think, not only in immigration, but in many other issues, we really need to be thinking about these big narratives. To me, that is what theological education is about. And because of that, it's not just the work of preparing clergy. It's really the work of the church trying to, at this moment, wrestle with how do we understand the world and what is happening and what influences that. And what does our faith, our understanding of the big picture, what God desires for the world, how does that influence how we think about issues that matter, about the environment or about immigration or others? Does that make some sense? Okay. Before I get started on a few things, just a few things. What brought you into this conversation? What are you hoping we might get to?
Well, it's interesting you talk about the Finnish background. My wife's brother-in-law, grandfather was from Finland. My daughter-in-law is from Guate, as she says. They had to leave 40 years ago. It was such a dangerous situation for them. I think she was 3 years old. Wow. She doesn't even like to talk about it. So you triggered a lot of thoughts there.
Yeah, so thinking about personal life experience and your family, it's about displacement, yeah.
And then I think about the Falasha Jews having to go back to Israel and not being fully accepted because of the color of their skin, even though they are probably directly related to Solomon North.
Yeah, so lots of things to think about people's mobility, so thinking of that globally. Good. Thanks, sir.
So personally, I'm troubled by our congregation not reflecting our community of Pleasanton, and the changes in Pleasanton have been pretty dramatic in terms of ethnicities of the students in schools and our neighbors, and we're not reflecting that. And I'd like to find out what we can do to better reflect our neighbors.
Yeah, and so that's it's a massive, drastic change. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening even more globally, right, within the California and the United States. How do we, what about the way we are organized or structured as communities of faith create such segregated spaces? And churches are very, very segregated. MLK called the 11 o'clock on Sunday morning the most segregated hour in America, right? And that regrettably 60 years later remains the case. Beck?
Well, I'm here because I came to church today.
Always a good thing.
Sorry, I don't come every Sunday, but I'm glad I did today. But I'm really appalled by the way our immigrants are treated and just bussed wherever and lied to. But on the other hand, in terms of balance, how do we balance the needs of the immigrants with the needs of our Americans? I have a relative that's barely living paycheck to paycheck. And how do we care for them? And how do we care for everybody fairly?
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's an encounter of Jesus with a lawyer, right? And we sometimes, the way the text reads is a lawyer stood up to test Jesus, right? So it's set up already as, you know, that's what lawyers do. They're a pain. And so his question is, who is my neighbor, right? And it's easy to dismiss that question. However, the United States has two very complex legal systems, the most complex, the tax law and immigration law. Those are the two most complex. And the question of immigration is, who is my neighbor? Who has the rights accorded to citizenship of this particular nation, and how far can we extend it? So the question should be wrestled with, right, about what exactly, how do we think about that question of who is my neighbor and to whom do we? Jesus' response is, you know, pushes us a bit to redefine what that may mean. But yeah. Did you have a comment question?
I have a question regarding something you just said a while ago, and something I think about, and that is that I still interact with people who really believe the fear-based narrative and everything that goes with it. And some of these people, I mean, they're sort of like the echo chamber. They really want affirmation of that, even though maybe underneath they know it doesn't really feel right. So without getting into a debate or jumping on sides or anything else, is there a way, when you run into that, is there something you say confidently and calmly that speaks about how you feel that might just cause people to maybe raise that question mark in their own mind about where all that really is coming from? Or what
No, I appreciate that. I'll say a brief response, and then I hope that the presentation I have will help keep thinking around that. Of course, every situation is different, every person, and so we all have to sort of interpret in a particular setting, you know, how we might respond to somebody else. So two things in an initial response. First, recognizing that fear is at play, right? Whether it's about resource allocation or some other sense of threat, right? And there is right now a very strong push for a narrative of fear. I did a Bible study on the book of Exodus. After you're done with the 6 weeks, you could do that one, 6 weeks. You can do it on your own. It's really meant for more conversation. It's a free Bible study. What I look at is how in the book of Exodus, it begins with fear, right? A new Pharaoh comes who does not know Joseph, right? So the people of Israel had ended up in Egypt because of Joseph helping out, and now all of a sudden a Pharaoh comes in who does not know the impact, does not recognize the value of that previous immigrant wave that came in, and so turns against them. And what he does is he begins to spin a tale of fear that is not really founded on reality, right? But it has a political purpose of being. Now, in contrast to that, anytime there's an encounter between humans and the divine in the Bible, it begins with the same phrase. What's the phrase? Fear not, do not be afraid, right? So part of it is recognizing that is our role, right? Like the encounter with God is trying to question the fears that are within us. To take them seriously, you know, are there particular reasons people are understanding this? But right now there is a very intentional process of fear-mongering. Really consistent, perennial, you know, and at a time in which we have lots of things happening that are making people already anxious. You know, we've spent years, the last couple of years, afraid of even other people because they could be carrying a disease that could kill us, right? And so right now our bodies, our society is primed for fear. And the polarization is an expression of that. So what I would say is, it is critical that we do have those conversations. I did an event for about 800 people that were gathering in El Paso, right in the middle of an earlier spike in the number of immigrants, and El Paso was an area that really was hitting that hard. And so we had about 800 people that came to help facilitate some of the response at that moment. But one of the people that was the presenter who handles, it's a priest who is at the center of a lot of the response, initially said to the group very provocatively, he said, "Why are you here?" The border is not the problem. This is the symptoms. This is the expression of what's happening inside the country. The laws that you are passing are creating this crisis. And so he said, instead of coming all the way here to the border, go across the street and talk to your neighbor. Because if your neighbor is voting for legislation that it makes it impossible for the country to respond adequately and to prepare, then that's where the conversation needs to be happening. So finding ways to talk is significant. So let me at least provide some ideas as we start that. And so if we go to the next slide, first of all, one of the common scriptural texts used to talk about immigration is welcome the stranger. That's a critical commandment. It is the most repeated commandment after, love the Lord your God. So it's love your neighbor as yourself and welcome the stranger because you were strangers in the land. So that is a constant repeated commandment over 600 times in the Bible. Now, the interesting thing about it is that that's just not enough, right? Because most religious communities and most conversations about Bible and immigration stay in that. So the first thing to recognize is that these are not strangers. There's certainly people who are coming as brand new immigrants into the country or attempting to come. And there's significant numbers and folks in that. But if we only focus on that, then it sort of feeds into the sense of the stranger and the other and the risk and the danger. So let me just go through a few statistics. So,
Could you define what an immigrant is? Is that a non-citizen?
anybody who was not born in the United States.
Okay.
In this category is anybody. So in these slides that I'll share now, the question was, what's an immigrant? In these slides, anybody foreign born. That was not, foreign born, but not to U.S. citizens. So not born, if your parents are U.S. citizens and you're born abroad, you're a U.S. national, regardless of where you're born. But, so these are immigrants so 27% of California residents, 1 in every 4 Californians is an immigrant, born abroad and then lives in California. That is the highest of any state in the nation. The next one that has a really high number is New York, and that's only 22%. So that's significant, but California has the highest. If we go to the next slide, and this is really significant, almost half of California children have at least one immigrant parent. So when the church does not engage conversations about immigration, what are we saying to half of our children whose lives are deeply affected by the decisions we make around immigration? So this is why this is an issue that it's not just a political issue. It is really an issue that the church ought to be concerned about. One of our concerns is where are children in our faith communities? Part of it is, are we tending to the issues that ultimately affect most of the children in our state? Does the community see this space, the church, as the place that is deeply committed to their well-being, to not just preaching, but delivering the gospel? If we go to the next one. Of the roughly 10.5 million immigrants in California, 2.9 are undocumented, or about 28%. The next thing, though, that's significant, if you go to the next slide, 78% of immigrants in California are citizens of the United States or have some other legal status. So these two numbers matter. There is a large number, about 3 million undocumented immigrants in California. And that's sometimes the focus of all of our discussion is about undocumented immigrants. That's 3 million. It's very significant, and that's a lot of individuals. But nearly 80% of all immigrants in California are either citizens or have legal status.
What do you mean by legal status?
So that means they either have a green card or some other permit to be able to be in the United States. So undocumented simply means you have entered the country unlawfully, or in most cases, you've entered through some way and then overstayed your visa. So you do not have authorization to be in the United States. But the vast majority of immigrants in California are here with, in a documented way. The reason this matters is because our perception of immigration tends to only be about one aspect of immigration and not understanding the complexity of it and the numbers of people who are impacted. This one is even more significant for us as a community and to the question about our neighborhoods. 91% of Latinos, which is one of the populations often associated as immigrants, 91% of 18 and under Latinos are U.S. citizens. Is that sinking in? 91%. Now, if we go to the next slide, 49% of children in California are Latino. So do the math, right? So what will happen in about 12 years in terms of the makeup of the state, right? Now, these children, this community is understood and understands itself as a migrant immigrant community. Not every single one. They're not all liberal. They don't, surprise to the Democratic Party, they don't all vote for Democrats. This is a very large, complex community. But issues around immigration need to be thought about in complex ways because they matter to huge numbers of people in our communities. At a place like VSR, we are seeing this firsthand. So 70% of our incoming class this fall are people of color. So this is what the makeup of our incoming class this fall looks like from all across the spectrum. It's changing the way we think about our educational experience and our work. For us as an institution to be able to move to this place, it's required not simply in terms of the question of how do we diversify an institution. For us, it meant we needed to really think seriously, not just about making sure the doors are open and a big sign says welcome, but that whatever happens inside reflects the community we are trying to create, what we study, how we study it, what examples we use for leadership. Do they reflect the communities we are seeking to educate? Are we learning from those communities and how they do church and how they think of church? Or are we simply trying to say, this is the way you do church, we'll give you a scholarship so you can come learn to do how we do it, and then you'll be great in the world, right? In order for us to truly transform our makeup, we needed to think seriously about every aspect of who we are. That's the wrestling. That's the limping, right? That will be necessary for our communities to do. You can feel it in the pit of your stomach. I'm not sure what that means. How are we going to do this? The thing is, in whatever time we have left, you'll keep me to time, we're not going to give you the exact answer of the program you need to do, but hopefully frame the level of its significance, how important it is given the reality of the nation and the people around us, particularly in California, and then also our calling to be able to do that.
I wanted to just remind everyone thank you for bringing up the statistics of immigration in California. And we've talked more in our community about immigration here in Tri-Valley, and those numbers are higher, right? So in Pleasanton, it's more like 33 to 37% of the community is born outside of the United States. 33% are in some process of permanent residency, citizenship. And because of the changes in migration patterns, the youngest and newest in our community, those numbers are even higher among them. So,
so part of it is starting to then think about how might we engage and get to know that large percentage of the community. We do need to think of that part of some members of that community as needing our support and assistance. But that can't be the only framework we use, right? We need to understand how they are actually the backbone of much of our community, right? And how are they helping to shape it?
So the figure that you said earlier in the sermon about the average median age of being in the 20s versus the 40s, the reality is, and it's true of Northern Europe as well as us, immigrants are our only salvation because we're all getting older and dying, and the people that are most anti-immigrant, they're not going to have their Social Security checks unless there's enough young people coming in. Immigrants are the only way that we're going to survive.
Amen. I mean, if you go to any nursing home, who's the care providers? Yeah, who's going to pay? Right now, for the first time, usually you have a pyramid of age in a society. The United States is turning into a rectangle, so that if you look at 5 generations, 0 to 20, 20 to 40, whatever, you do the math there, is becoming almost straight. It does not work financially. Those retirement accounts, not just Social Security, we're already given up on that, but just the very market economy, even our own investments, depend on a much larger workforce. The foreign board, well, we talked about 27% of U.S. California population are immigrants or foreign-born. It's about 36% of the labor force is immigrant. So it's much larger because that immigrant population tends to come during their work life, during their work period. It's folks that are coming between 16, 15. The majority of immigrants come during that period of time between 15 and 30. Mm-hmm.
That speaks to the gentleman's point about how do we then change the system in a way to where they're contributors to the tax system.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to support the future. I mean, because I think a lot of the press tends to almost in some way move toward undocumented, burden to society, causing all onward effects to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
When if there was a process to move these people into citizenship and Social Security cards and taxes, then
Yeah.
the issue would probably help to resolve itself over time.
So 2 things, and I'll come to your question about that. The first one is, you're right, this is a fear-driven rhetoric. Every single study done on immigrants and the economy is a positive in every single setting. It doesn't really matter. A larger immigrant population improves the economy of any city, state you're in, period. It's a plus. Right now, New York has a large influx. There's concern about it. Solution, let them work. I mean, they're all looking for work, and there's a lot of need for work. What we have as a nation is we have a very kind of confused idea between, we have 2 signs on the border, on all of our borders. One says, keep away. The other one says, help wanted, right? So this is the dissonance. But on the economic reality, first of all, immigrants pay taxes. They just don't benefit from them. Even undocumented immigrants pay taxes. The only way an undocumented immigrant doesn't pay taxes is if their employer doesn't submit those taxes to the state. But that's the employer's responsibility. I don't know about you all, but I'm sure I'll file my taxes in April, but I'm required to file taxes and my employer is required to take them from me, correct? If we just left it up to everybody just being nice and showing up and bringing it in, it is the employer's responsibility to take your taxes. Most of them do. There's a massive surplus into the Social Security that is part of what's keeping it alive of undocumented workers and even unauthorized immigrants who pay into the system but cannot get those benefits back. So that's the system right now. So actually, undocumented immigrants, all immigrants, pay taxes because they overrepresent in the workforce, actually pay more taxes on average, not necessarily based on wealth, but percentage of participation into the tax system. So the numbers are there. The reality is that. But the narrative is one of fear. The narrative is one of scarcity. And the focus on saying our systems are being taxed. That's a particular narrative. Even our current surge in the number of immigrants is really minute for the size of this nation. It really is minute. So what I want you to try to imagine, so I did some work in Jordan. Jordan is a tiny country, and it has millions of immigrants, of refugees coming from Syria's conflict, from Palestine and Israel, from displacement, from all around them. That's an overwhelmed system. When you have a population of refugees that is almost a third of your entire population. We're a huge nation with huge assets. We are not really threatened or incapable of managing the well-being of people that may be coming to us. But we've created a system that is not intended to facilitate that, but it's intended to stop it, right? Mhm. Here and then here, sorry. Huh?
I was going to ask about, you kind of say that the anti-immigration stance is like, and that like sentiment is like fear-driven. And I was kind of wondering about like how much do you think like the historical roots of like American nativism still like impacts today?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, lots, right? So think about earlier today, I said, we are wrestling with our sins of origin. So how was the nation, again, these are the narratives. How was the nation formed? Freedom-seeking people who had been exploited and were escaping the oppression of monarchies came to this nation to build it. That's our narrative, right? Of course, the counter-narrative or the other underbelly of that narrative is there were people here, right? Now, people will say, well, my ancestors came here illegally. I mean, most of them just got on a boat, got here. If they were not sick with a contagious disease, they were handed 40 acres of land. Talk about burden on the system, right? You take 40 acres of land, just hand them to them. Nobody's getting that right now. Nobody's asking for that right now. So, yes, some of that nativism is the idea that, and it is very religious, it is the idea of manifest destiny, that God, if you read the language of the formation of the nation, of a lot of the language, it's alarming to see how deeply embedded white supremacy was into the creation of much of our understanding of the nation. And so part of the fear now is these folks look different, right? And that's been the case. In California, Chinese Exclusionary Act, passed in the late 1800s. It was intended specifically after the Chinese had built the railroad, and that was completed, to refuse their ability to own land or become citizens of the United States, right? Native Americans did not receive U.S. citizenship until 1926. Native Americans. Man, this is like... So, this is like... So, citizenship, who is my neighbor, is a political decision a group of people make about who is our neighbor. We make that decision. This did not come from on heaven, from on high. We as a nation decide who is part of our community, who has the benefits of this community, and how they have the ability to contribute. And that's what our policies are about. I mean, we're trying to defend our democracy for a reason. I think there were a couple of you here. Oh, Mike, yep. Oh, sorry, you had one, and then we'll go back, sorry.
You kind of addressed it, but the biggest thing is, you mentioned there's the legal and the tax portion. The legal and the tax portion. And the tax portion is the thing, because you addressed partially that Social Security, I've heard 25% of Social Security income comes from, undocumented people who will not necessarily ever be able to collect it. Mm-hmm. So that 25% is supporting the other 75% in a large faction. The same thing goes with workforce, especially when you get to the skill sources which don't take a lot of education to do it, masonry, construction, and things like that. High percentage. Do you have numbers on any of that, on what percentage are undocumented?
Yeah, well, you go ahead and pass it back. Broadly, let me see, if we go to, let me just start out with an interesting image here. Can you go to slide 24? Yeah. There we go. So this is an article from a while back. This is from 2009. So this is right in the middle of our last, crisis, economic crisis, the bubble, the housing market bubble. Give me your tired, your poor, your startup founders. So this is what the choir was singing about, right? So the first thing to the statistics about participation in the labor force, 56% of Silicon Valley companies, startups, have been founded or co-founded by a foreign-born individual. 56%. So the first thing to think about is migration affects the entire spectrum of our economic reality. That's probably the case here in terms of the immigrant population. So it's important to focus on the undocumented individuals who are coming out of need and desperation. It's also important to pay attention to the fact that actually immigrant communities are quite complex and bring lots of different levels of skill and capacity. Because our system is set up to benefit more skilled labor in terms of technology, where our needs are in that area, we recognize that need. We don't recognize it, even though we have it, in landscaping, agriculture, healthcare. So the numbers of those who work undocumented in some of those field labor is actually much higher than it would be in the technology side, because we have ways and mechanisms for people to actually work legally in the United States, obtain paperwork to work and live if they come into certain fields, but not in others. So what we do is we force part of the labor to work as undocumented, right? So the statistics, for example, in meat packing in the United States, over 90% of the workers in meat packing are all undocumented. Yeah. So think about what happened, if you look up the story of the children of Smithfield. It's a powerful story about how the parents were being forced to continue to work through the pandemic, to continue to produce our food, right? And because they had no way to represent themselves. They couldn't speak up. Because creating a population that does not have access to legal representation and access to be part of the nation actually creates a real crisis for them. It creates the opportunity for their exploitation, for the reduction of their compensation. Those things are not the cause of their being immigrants. It is the cause of making some of them not have the ability to have legal representation. And it's also the consequence of the lack of enforcement. Because actually in the United States, it doesn't really matter whether you have a permit to work or not. If I hire you to do a job, I'm required to keep all the wage and hour laws. I cannot exploit you, right? So even if you're undocumented, you're supposed to be getting minimum wage, you're supposed to be getting overtime. The thing is, nobody's prosecuting that. So if I take advantage of you, you can't go talk to anybody because the first thing they'll do is ask you for your papers. And what they'll do is they'll deport you rather than go after me for exploiting you. So again, this is all about how we privilege certain practices. Even just fulfilling our laws. The rhetoric against undocumented immigrants is we're a nation of laws. Well, we're not even fulfilling our own current commitments of the law. But go ahead. I think it's here and then on the back. Sorry.
Okay. Mine was for your pie chart. And the one thing that I've experienced is that there's a lot of people that I've talked to that are immigrants, and they're put into categories because of where they came from, not their family of origin as they see it. Mm-hmm. So like I have a friend that is Peruvian, but she is actually Japanese. Mm-hmm. And so she identifies with the Japanese culture, but she's considered a Latina because of that. And I have another friend from Brazil that is also, she's German, and she lived in the area where the Germans were, and this is way before World War II, and so they spoke German, but she's offended that they said she was Latina. She says, I'm German. No. You have to be Latina.
Yeah.
So,
So a couple.
There's that kind of a thing. Why aren't they allowed to say, I'm Scandinavian or whatever, to let them have that ability? Instead, we put it because of where they came from. And I think it's a little unfair for us to do that.
If you want to pass it back while I respond to that. So two responses. First one, I've been in the U.S. 36 years, so I filled out 4 different census. Every time I fill the census, I have to click different boxes. Our understanding of what a Latino or Hispanic is keeps changing, right? So literally in every one of the last 4 census, the way they've tried to deal with Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, whatever, it keeps shifting. So the phrase I would say is, race means nothing, and it means everything. So that's the challenge, right? Biologically, race means absolutely nothing. There's more genetic diversity within African Americans than there is between African Americans and white, right? Genetically. There is almost no difference Race is really all a construct. It's all made up. So the categories will always be faulty, right? But it means everything because we have used these categories to organize our assets. In one of our courses on contextual thinking, we talk about the 500-year project. Over the last 500 years, beginning with an action on the part of the Pope that basically said Europeans can go, and anywhere they go, because they're bringing the gospel, can just do whatever they want, wherever they get to, and take over everything, right? So that started a process of centering certain. So we created a taxonomy. Race, the concepts of race began at that time to be able to separate people between various categories, temperaments, and we began to associate all kinds of things with skin color and regionality in order to organize ourselves, just like we did with gender, right? We created strict categories of gender in order to keep women in a certain place and men in another place. So humans always create taxonomies, organize themselves as a way to distribute assets and wealth. So what I would say is, yes, it's a very fluid reality. Race, nationality, it's all very, very fluid and shifting. But right now, so some attempts are to say, well, let's just be colorblind. Would that be great if it didn't really matter? But it does, right? So for a while, we'll be wrestling with categories that are imperfect and that I think are going to have to be wrestled with. And Latinos are particularly that way because it isn't a racial category. You have Latinos that run the entire spectrum of race. So.
It's like saying, I'm a U.S. citizen, but I have a background of having this as my heritage. So why isn't the person that comes and says that they're Japanese from Peru, why aren't they able to say, because that's what they celebrate at home.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel like that's disallowing what they.
Well, and the interesting thing is, depending on where they're at, if they're walking, for others, who I have friends who, my neighbors across the street were Korean growing up in Guatemala, for them, for some people it's the opposite, right? Like they're not recognized for that part of their identity. They're only viewed through, particular kind of descriptions that people may have about what a nation is. And of course, Asian, what does that mean? Like, 2/3 of the population of the world? So part of it, in terms of what you're saying for Caucasian Americans, the difference is I'm Latino or Hispanic American. My children are African American, right? So there's already an automatic qualifying to be an American. If you're white, you can choose to celebrate your heritage, but that's not necessarily something that anybody else is putting on you, right? Does that make sense? So that's even a weird dynamic in this, right? It's like for some people, this is a choice. I can elect to celebrate my heritage. Many of us lost it, may not have much understanding of it. But for others, no matter how long you've been in the country and how long your family has been, this hyphenated identity is imposed on you. So lots of work to be done about how we think. And it's all about boundaries, right? And who belongs. So, good.
There seems to be a labor shortage in the building trades and other hands-on jobs because a lot of young people don't want to go into that work to get their hands dirty. Is it true that that's much more true of native-born young people than of immigrants?
In terms of their desire to continue?
Their willingness to take those kinds of jobs.
Yeah. I mean, I think, for any of us, the nation or our economic system compensates certain things. The farther you are from the ground in your job, the more you get paid. So a friend of mine says, if you get up in the morning, the difference in your job is whether you shower before or after you go to work, right? So do you shower to go to work because your work is clean? Or do you shower after work because work in itself is dirty, right? And it makes you dirty, right? So that's the distinction. So people, the whole society is structured to privilege, certain forms of work and not others. How we get paid matters greatly depending on the kind of work. So yeah, every person that has a chance to do something that is better compensated, that requires a different kind of effort or better serves their skill, will pursue that. And so generationally, as people have options, they'll exercise those options. But we want that to happen, actually, right? We would want both our individual children, but the nation as well, to educate, to be better prepared, and to develop more work and other kinds of work. So the question is, in construction, again, similar to meat production, construction, the levels of construction for foreign-born, particularly undocumented, are upwards of 75%. And in some areas, it's completely. If you've had your roof done, if you had your lawn done, I mean, you know what that looks like. So, but at times, this is a really quirky thing. If you look at the story of Exodus, and Pharaoh's trying to deal with, first he says, the Israelites are more powerful and numerous than us, and in the event of war, they'll turn against us. So we must deal with them shrewdly. This is a political statement. It's a lie. The Israelites, even if they're multiplying like bunnies, are not going to be more than the Egyptians, and certainly not more powerful. But the political machination is to say, they're a threat. We're going to deal with them shrewdly. So he tries a bunch of different things. One of them is forced labor. And what it says exactly is that it imposed of them hard labor in field and construction. I mean, just think about how, this is like, where are we forcing people into work? The United States has raised its food through forced labor through most of its history. With slaves, with sharecroppers, with braceros, and now we have a legal system that allows us to have people that have no representation do this work so we can keep it cheap. So there are very powerful economic interests. They get dressed up as legality and illegality as if the law is God-given. We make the law. We decide whether we're going to get people to come pick all of our grapes so we can have wine and then not give them the ability to come in and do that with dignity and access to protections. We need their labor. In the United States right now, under our current law, immigration law, there are only 5,000, that's it, 5,000 visas that can be given to field labor. It's ridiculous. That doesn't even serve one little valley in the United States, much less the level of need we have for labor. So, we're not finding the solutions as to how we're going to get more brown people into this building. We're not necessarily finding the solutions about what we're going to do about immigration. What I hope that we are doing in this conversation is first recognize the significance of the conversation. That really this is, as we feel it in our bodies, something that requires what a third seminary word for you, metanoia, conversion. The text of conversion, when we are converted, when we are transformed, when the scripture says, do not be conformed to the ways of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. That this is the work of religious communities. Many younger generations and others around us, our neighbors, regardless of their generation, are becoming disenchanted with the church and its practices because it is hard sometimes to understand what the heck it is up to. Is it doing this kind of hard work that it takes to come into community? And wrestle with these questions as you're willing to do today. Can we really sit with this, wrestle with it, not just go for the easy answers because there are none. Some of them are complex. But what I'm convinced about is that we are pretty bright humans. We've created incredibly complex ideas. So let me move to that really quick. I'm not going to go through the rest of the presentation because we've had exactly the conversation we needed to have. But let me... Well, yeah.
I do have one quick question.
All right. And
So
how are we
the
on time?
question is, and you've dealt very eloquently with the issue of economics, but that's not the only fear that is out there relative to immigrants, and I'm reminded of how former President Trump cast aspersions on immigrants as being non-law abiding. And how do you address that?
Again, it's an
calling the kettle black, yeah.
It's the thing about it is that that's another example where it's about narratives and not reality, right? Statistically, undocumented immigrants have an incidence of crime that is about half of that of U.S. citizens. And there's a simple reason. You don't want to get caught. You know that if you get caught, it's not going to be just a slap on the wrist, right? You're likely to end up in a system that will deport you. And you'll be torn away from your family. You could end up with much greater consequences. So it's not true, but the perception is that it is. Some people might be convinced by numbers and realities. They'll question the numbers. They're not going to agree to it because they know the one person or the one situation. Because again, the news will kind of percolate this stuff. Again, one of those illegalities is, why don't people, make a line? People have been saying this for decades. They're making a line right now at the U.S.-Mexico border. There's a very long line. People are waiting, sitting in the river, literally waiting to be processed, right? We can't even process them fast enough because we pretend that, oh, wow, what a surprise. There's all this environmental stuff happening all over the world. There's crises going on. We as a nation have some responsibility, and so that will displace people. It will happen. So what I'm saying is the greatest illegality that people will perceive is that violation of crossing the border without authorization. The reality is most people would be very willing to stand in a line if there was one. The one that is there right now, which allows, by our nation's laws, you can come to the United States as a refugee and request asylum. That is the legal framework we have. Right now, we are so backed up in processing that's where we end up with the sense of people just desperately going around those systems. But hundreds, thousands of them are literally sitting in the U.S. border, U.S.-Mexico border, waiting.
Yeah, I kind of have a question. You kind of talk about how, it's like especially for immigrants, how, they don't want to get caught because of deportation. And I was wondering about your opinion on, sanctuary cities or states, kind of the legality of it, because if an immigrant who committed a crime is detained by the state, the federal government cannot dispatch ICE to deport them because of anti-Colombian laws. So I was kind of wondering about how does the federal government really plays into it and tries to deport people?
Yeah. So, we've had different periods of kind of heightened enforcement of deportation. On average, the United States had about 11 million undocumented immigrants for the last, it's been a pretty stable number for the last probably 15 years, 20 years. And that's because some people move back, others are, over time find ways into, authorized presence. But so about 11 million. Deportation is impossible. And everybody knows it, right? So I'll give you a number. PSR is in the campus of UC Berkeley. We were there first, actually. PSR was founded in 1866. 2 years later, the same founder started the California College or acquired it. That became UC Berkeley. So I like to say that there's a little prep school down the hill from PSR. So there are upwards of 40,000 students now at UC. You would have to deport the entire student body of UC Berkeley every day for a year, including holidays and weekends, and that's what 11 million people are. You would have to round up 40,000 people every single day and deport them, right? So deportation is not a solution. It is impossible to fulfill, right? So any perceptions we have that, Trump's going to say, I'm going to kick them all out, it would devastate the economy of the nation. It would do, as we have seen on our screens, devastate our very moral fiber as a nation to do. And everybody knows this, so it's all rhetoric. Now, that rhetoric comes at a very high price because a significant number, nothing compared to actually addressing undocumented immigrants, there's just no physical way to do it. Does this make sense? There's no physical way to do it. We do not have the capacity to chase this many people, round them up, and send them back, and it would devastate us. So what we do is we make a show out of a handful of them to create a sense of fear among the community. Is this what a powerful nation should be doing to some of the most vulnerable people in its midst? Is that really what it's in keeping with our Christian values, with our national identity? I definitely don't think so. Hence, this is not, it is not just a political issue or an economic one. It is really a true moral issue. So what we do right now is we jail about, we jail a lot of people, more than anybody else in the world, and a large portion of them are undocumented work immigrants who've done nothing most of the time, or perhaps a misdemeanor, but are jailed while they're waiting to be processed and deported because the system is so backlogged. So we do have a large number of people in our prisons that are here, that are in prison for nothing else other than an immigration violation. So these are tough questions. We've dealt with a few of them and just touched them. So where do we go from here? My own sense is that, and let me get to in a second, just that we're incredibly complex. We have created an economic system that assembles materials, this little thing. I mean, it's incredible what it can do. There are amazing minds that have been able to think about how to assemble an incredible amount of materials from all over the world and resources and technology to create something quite remarkable. Migration is ultimately a function of trade. People follow trade. Joseph ended up in Egypt because that was the trade line. When there was a conflict between siblings that led to the displacement of one of them, then exactly. another one of the wrestling between siblings in the Bible. When his brothers sold him, they go to this point, Dothan, and they don't even remember when they retell the story which group took him. If it was the Midianites or the Ishmaelites, they can't remember. Because Dothan was the trading post, and caravan after caravan came by. So they didn't know if it was the 7 o'clock or the 9 o'clock or the 11 o'clock train. The thing is that Joseph ended up in Egypt because that's where the trade took him, right? When his brothers were hungry, there was a famine, where did they go? They went to Egypt. Now, why did they go to Egypt? They knew all the resources were going to Egypt. They have been shipping them there because that's what the trade does. So when a person in Guatemala is trying to find opportunity, where do they go? They know where all the products are going. All of our coffee, all of our bananas, all of our oil, all of our wood, it's all going north. So what do? They follow trade. The only product they have to sell is their labor. That's it. They don't have large cash amounts to invest. What they have is labor, work. That's what they want to come here to do. That's it. So we have created an extremely complex trading system, and that is creating an extremely complex migration reality. And the same brains and resources that can create that economic system, I believe, have the capacity to create a much more humane, much more thriving system of mobility. Some people fear that if we open up the borders, and I'm not suggesting opening up the borders just generally to everybody, anything, it will settle. The fear is somehow the entire southern hemisphere is going to move to the United States. It's not going to happen. I'm one of 8 children in my family. I'm the only one here, and one brother in Florida. Everybody else is in Guatemala. They're fine. They have no desire to leave. Of course, they are in a different position than many others who are forced to leave. They don't depend on crops that are being affected by environmental changes, like many people do. So what I'm saying is this fear that somehow this is all impossible to do is too complex. Well, I can tell you that making this thing is quite complex. But we can do this. We can do this. The role of the church, of our faith communities, is to bring inspiration to that work, commitment to it, accountability to it. The Bible is packed of stories of migration that connect with many of the issues we're dealing with today. They may not give us the statistics or the solutions exactly, but they give us a sense of where God is in terms of those who are on the move. And so I encourage you to spend time as a community, as you try to think about how do we diversify this community? How do we think anew about this place? To commit to that hard work together, to study, to learn together, to think about the various disciplines you either already work in or have worked in the past, and to think about how does that discipline, that tradition, that knowledge base help us to rethink a lot of these issues that bring us together. So I'll take one last question because we're at time, probably a little bit past it, and glad to stick around longer, but I want to make sure we at least have a moment where you can all...
Well, mine's more of a process of what we can do. I had my granddaughter, who is 10, posted Hispanic Heritage Week. Well, her dad is half Hispanic. She has actually, and I've done DNA, and I'm kind of finding 34 nationalities in her. Now, people here will probably think of me as Hispanic, and most tend to think of me as Mexican. My mother would have arguments with my brother. No, you're Salvadoran. My mother is from Salvadoran. My ethnicity is 1/3 to Spain, 1/3 to Northern Europe, and the other part comes from Africa and all over the world. So that's me. I worked at a government facility, therefore I had to declare an ethnicity. I am actually stated over 40 years of working in the lab, Hispanic, not self-identified. That is how they classify me. My sister, Carlson, married a Swede. Her kids, in the school record she found, are defined as Hispanic. So I think one of the things we can do is educate, and I sent my granddaughter her heritage. It's emotional. My grandfather was killed in a coup in El Salvador. He was the treasurer of El Salvador. My grandmother left Mexico when they hung a priest in the front yard. So that is why I am here. But I never even knew any of that until I never had prejudice growing up. I was in a blue-collar Irish Catholic neighborhood in a good school in San Francisco. It wasn't until I went into the Army that I had people who would not talk to me. Yeah. That's where I experienced. So we have to educate the young.
Thank you. Thank you for being vulnerable with your story and allowing us to create a space for it with you. Elie Wiesel is a rabbi, author. He quotes the rabbi saying, God created humankind for the love of story. Our stories matter greatly. And the stories that are being told about immigrants and the reasons we have come, our own stories often of our families are repressed out of that desire simply to adapt to a new place, to a new community, and to avoid the legacies of inequality that have been attached to our origins. This is sacred work to heal our own individual, personal, family brokenness, to recognize that ultimately we are a heck of a lot more interconnected than divided, that there is an agenda for the taxonomies that have been created. And challenging those is hard work. But in the midst of that, and we focused on the challenges and the griefs, but as is your story, as is the story of many of our families, of many of us, there are also stories of incredible resilience. And if we begin to think about every one of these families, not as a threat to us, but really as the people who embody that same sense that in all of its imperfection formed this nation, longing, a yearning to be free. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. Encourage your continued conversation, and we are glad to be a partner with you in that work. And blessings for the work ahead as you try to think about your community into the future. Thanks. Hmm.